Hi, my name is Mary Jane McCallum, and I'm here to introduce the fourth lecture in a special series about the history of Indigenous education. The series is sponsored by the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous People, History and Archives, and is hosted by the Winter 2025 class of the University of Winnipeg students in History 2616, History of Indigenous Education, Residential Schools and Beyond. It's facilitated by Studio 1L10, and thank you to the staff there, as well as to Catherine Boschman and Jack Nestor. In this series, invited guests do a formal lecture for about 20 to 45 minutes, and at that point, we excuse those who are joining us on Zoom, and then we turn the class discussion over to our class, and the students who are in the class can ask questions of the invited speaker. Our invited speaker today is Jackson Pind, coming to us over Zoom. Dr. Pind is mixed Anishinaabe settler historian with family ties to Alderville First Nation. He's an assistant professor at the Cheney Wenjack School of Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, and his research focuses on the history of Indigenous education, in particular relating to Indian day schools, which will be the topic for today's talk, land and place-based learning, oral history, and Indigenous settler relations in relation to climate change. So the title of his talk today is Histories of Indian Day Schools in Canada. And it's also the subject of his award-winning PhD dissertation and an interactive website with 699 Indian day schools from across Canada that are mapped onto a digital map, and you can click onto them and find out a little bit about them, how long that they were open for. Basically, the map covers 1880 to 2009, and it links in Indian Affairs records, so RG10 records as well. So it's really fascinating. It's indianDaySchools.org, and so I've spent a couple of different afternoons looking at this amazing website. But I'll turn it over to you, Jackson. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here speaking with you this afternoon. I'll just share my screen and kind of get underway with the presentation. But yeah, thank you, Dr. McCallum, for the invitation to come into your class and talk more about my research on the history of Indian day schools. I'll talk a little bit about the history today and some stuff that I think is obviously in the past, but also try to bring it into the present as well, because I think a lot of these questions are still ongoing right now. And I'll also try to kind of follow the footsteps of some big names in the field. I know like Sean Carlton was before me, and last week or the week before was Dr. Crystal Fraser, and people that I look up to as a historian. So I'll do my best. And I'll start things off, though, just by giving a little bit of a warning, I think, a content warning about some of the material this afternoon. I think, obviously, when you talk about these topics, especially if you are Indigenous or have Indigenous ancestry, they could bring up some negative feelings as well. So there is this hotline I encourage you to reach out to if you are struggling with any of the material I talk about today. It's www.hopeforwellness.ca. It's available 24/7, and there's also a 1-800 number there as well. And I always like to say that I've used this hotline in the past when studying this history, because it can get difficult at times. You'll see some examples today of some of these harder histories that I think we need to confront as Canadians in this country. And many people, maybe this is the first time you've heard about Indian day schools, and it's really not as studied as much as the residential school system. So that's just, I like to give a little warning before we get into the content today. And again, I'll try to keep it to about 45 minutes or so. I can talk about this for, I think, a whole whole class could just be on Indian Day School. So maybe that's something down the line the University of Winnipeg may want to check out. But just as a brief overview before we get into today, kind of the little bit of the structure of how I've kind of planned this talk. I'm going to actually kind of start off with kind of giving you an introduction into just what day schools are, and really starting in the present in many ways, talking about this Indian Day School class action lawsuit that unfortunately just wrapped up or is wrapping up right now as we speak. And there's been lots of criticisms of that lawsuit and how it's been handled over the last 5 years or so. I'll then kind of walk us back in time a little bit, focusing on the kind of territory that I'm on, which is nearby Curve Lake First Nation, and share the histories and stories I've been able to work with that community through my dissertation and now into a book that's coming out later this fall. So I'll share just a few small snippets of those stories. Again, it's a whole book's coming out about that, but I'll share some of the highlights and stories that I think are important for you to know about just one Indian Day School. As kind of Dr. McCallum was saying, there's 699, and there's very little research right now on any of the schools across Canada. And then we'll end with just a little bit of the future where I hope Indian Day School research will be going, as we're kind of at a crossroads right now in this country politically and with reconciliation and Indigenous people. And I think there needs to be more work done in this field, and hopefully maybe a call to action to some of the students in that class that maybe want to pursue further graduate research potentially down the line. We're always looking at trend. If you're interested, we can talk about that maybe after in the Q&A. But again, before I get really into it, I just want to kind of situate myself as well of where I'm actually calling from. And I'll introduce myself with my Anishinaabe Moan language, which I've been trying to learn as best as possible here. So, Ani Bojo Jackson Indigenous, Meingin Indodadum, Nagojo Anan and Donjaba, Sindam Zaga and Ga, Michisaga Anishinaabe Nini Zaga Nash. Hi, my name is Jackson. I was born and raised in Peterborough, which is kind of right down here in the middle of the lakes here of the Trent Severn Waterway. And I currently live just outside of Kingston, but I am calling you today from Peterborough. And I have mixed ancestry, as Dr. McCallum said, some Anishinaabe ancestry from Alderville First Nation, and then a bunch of different European nations as well. That's kind of mixed together here. And a picture of where Ontario is situated. And I'm calling today from Treaty 20, or the Rice Lake Purchase, which is right in the middle of your screen there, as well as really connected to the Williams Treaty, which I won't get too much. Again, this is a whole other thing we could talk about, the Williams Treaty and how that impacted education as well. But many historians call the Williams Treaty the worst treaty in Canadian history. It was the last historical treaty signed between the Crown and Indigenous nations in 1923 before the modern treaty process kind of kicked off in the 1970s. And it was the only one where Indigenous people lost their right to hunt and fish. So you'll see how that theme kind of comes through a little bit in this lecture in a little while when we talk about Curve Lake. And there's 7 Williams Treaties nations. Alderville, where I'm from, is one of them, and Curve Lake is another, and there's another 5 that we won't get into today. But those are kind of where I'm talking to you today from. And I think it's important just to situate myself here on the land and remember that as we go through some of these stories today. And it's important, I think, to just recognize my own family and kind of the story of why I'm maybe here this afternoon telling you this talk. My own ancestry was really disrupted by colonialism in many ways. There's a picture of my great-great-grandfather, Chief Moses Marsden, and he was chief of Alderville for about 6 years at the turn of the 1900s, from about 1903 to 1909. And unfortunately, as a result of kind of the colonial policies at the time, he decided to enfranchise, which was a really hard decision, I think, at the time for him to make. And ultimately it moved, if you don't know what enfranchisement is, I hope most of you do know, especially if you're taking this course, but I think basically meant that he was no longer Indigenous under the Indian Act and was allowed to leave the community of Alderville. And I think, to my knowledge, one of the only chiefs that made that decision. And he brought his 13 kids that he had at the time away from the residential and day schools that were operating in Alderville at that time. So it disconnected us from our culture and our language, but it also in some ways protected us from these really punishing schools at that time. And it's kind of been our generation, especially a couple generations down, to kind of reconnect and hopefully do his story justice here. So we're kind of doing a lot of this work in his honor and making sure that his legacy is remembered as someone that made a really courageous and brave decision at that time under a lot of colonial pressure. So that gives you just a little bit of a background about who I am and maybe where I'm speaking from today when I talk about this history going forward. But just to give a little bit of a background about what's an Indian Day School, and I'm glad I already got a plug for the website that you could check out maybe right now if you're on your phone or listening in the background. But it's indiandayschools.org. You can see more of kind of the digital history work that I've done. But if you're not aware what an Indian Day School was, it was basically a forced, segregated school that was on reserve, and over 200,000 children are actually forced to go to these Indian Day schools. And they basically operated on every single First Nation community and reserve from the mid 1800s until roughly around 2000. And that number has been shifting here over the last couple of years. And it was very similar to the residential school system if you look just at that history. So it was run by the government of Canada and funded by them, but the actual daily operations were given to a bunch of different church organizations that you can see there. And the same very similar experiences happened. A lot of physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse occurred, as well as the main purpose was to try to get rid of the Indian in the child in many ways. It was try to remove the culture from these communities and students, and also remove the language was a big thing, as we'll see later on in my presentation. So if you do go to the website, you can actually go to the top right-hand corner, and there's a little search bar. You can search your address, and the closest Indian Day School kind of comes up of where you're from. So the closest one to, I think, the University of Winnipeg, the Quad, which I actually haven't been there, so I assume that's kind of the maybe main place on campus that it kind of brought us to. But the closest school is 65 kilometers away in Broken Head. Reserve, which is in Manitoba, obviously. And again, it was run by the Anglican Church of Canada, opened in the 1870s and then closed in the 1970s. And again, to my knowledge, I tried to look and see if there's any research yet done on this school, but there hasn't been anything formally done. So again, if you're from that area and want to do a research project, obviously working with Broken Head Reserve would be a great place to start, I think. But yeah, that gives you just a little background onto what day schools are as I start talking about them here. And I do like kind of giving just a when, who, and where, just kind of like the five W's, or just the three in this case, of how these schools were operating. So if you look at the map, you'll see this on the side. You can look at the different columns. You can see on the left-hand side that the largest time that they're in operation was actually in the 1960s. 571 of these schools were operating at once, which obviously was a huge job for the government to manage these schools. And you can see why maybe some of these problems emerged, as we'll talk about that in a little bit. The largest religious affiliation that was in charge of the school was actually the Roman Catholics. They had 327 schools. And then a few years ago, when the Pope came to apologize kind of for the role of the Roman Catholic Church in residential schools, he did not mention Indian Day schools. And to my knowledge, the Roman Catholic Church has not referenced or referred to Indian Day schools at all, despite you can see how many schools that they did operate. And then finally, their largest province in operation was in Ontario, with 172 operating at one time in the province. And then if you look at Manitoba, Manitoba for its size really had a lot of schools as well. They had 115 schools, which I believe is the second most in the country at that time. So for a much smaller population than Ontario, obviously that is a lot of Indian Day schools that were operating in that province. And I think that's just as a quick overview of where these schools were. I think it gives you kind of a zoomed out version of where they're operating throughout kind of the last 150 or so years. But if we look again at this map, we can see, we can overlay the treaties, for instance. And in some ways, there were provisions for education in the treaties. And other places you can see, especially around the Ottawa and out east region, as well as out west towards BC, all of the unceded territory that also had Indian Day schools, where you can see that despite the fact the Canadian government really didn't have any say whatsoever over those lands, they still forced Indian Day schools into those communities, which I think is an important thing, again, to remember through some of the conversations that we're going to have here later on in this lecture. So again, kind of going through this a little quick, but I just want to give you some kind of almost a macro scale of how these schools are operating in the country here. And I think this GIF or GIF, whatever one you like to say, I think does a pretty powerful job of showing first the expansion of the system of the Indian day schools, as you can see as it slowly emerges here in the 1800s and then quickly speeds up through kind of the middle of the 1900s and then slowly closes as well. But I'll just let this play for a second and just show you the scale of the schools. Oh, Sean Carlton and I worked on that together to kind of show the development. And as I said, if you looked at that map, maybe 5 or 6 schools have actually been investigated. So a lot more work needs to be done, I would argue. And that really takes us kind of to the first story. And I like to always talk about this story because I think it's important to show how I started getting into this field of research. I had been already doing some prior investigations prior to 2018 on the Indian day schools, just as a student and someone that was connected to Alderville and Curve Lake. I had heard about them before and just random files and random encounters with people. But this lecture, in many ways, changed the course of my life. And I think Kevin Lamoureux was working at the University of Winnipeg before he went on leave to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Maybe he is back there as well. I'm not 100% where he is now, but he was kind of coming at the time to Queen's University and gave this kind of keynote lecture, which was free. I almost didn't go, but my professor told me to go, and maybe that's why you're also in this room today as well. So maybe this will spiral off into another life-changing moment for someone. But I went to this lecture. And Kevin was talking about the role of public schools in advancing the calls to action. And I kind of sat through the whole lecture. I thought he gave, if you've ever seen Kevin speak, he's a fabulous speaker, kind of giving a really emotional history of what happened in Canada. And then afterwards, I kind of got up the courage and went down and introduced myself. And I kind of just posed this question. I said, I know you talked a lot about residential schools, but you didn't say anything about Indian day schools. And I was curious why that wasn't kind of part of your talk, because I thought actually that was an important topic you could have kind of looked into. And he basically looked at me and said that that story had not been told yet. And instead, he wrote down the name of this elder named Raymond Mason and told me to call this guy out of the blue. He said he'll basically receive your call and tell you this history that hasn't been told yet. And I kind of followed his advice. I called him one morning a couple weeks later in early February 2018. And that phone call changed my life in many ways and opened my eyes to the Indian day school survivors and residential school survivors who have been telling these stories for a very long time. So I won't go into the whole relationship that I had with Ray, but it was kind of expansive. We started talking on the phone almost weekly and then daily. And he was involved in some really big movements that were happening at that time, especially for Indian day school survivors. And sadly, he would pass away just about 5 years after our first conversation in 2022. There was a really nice video I think I'm going to play just to show you his legacy and ties back in to the Indian day school system. And Ray was from Peguis First Nation, which is very close to Winnipeg. He spent a lot of time in Winnipeg, obviously, because it's a nearby city. And this video, I think, does a good job of talking about his legacy in a very short form. So this played after he died at the CBC.
Being along the water, being in nature, is one of the ways he and I connected.
When Kyle Mason stands beside the Red River, he thinks of his father, Raymond. He passed away on Sunday at the age of 75 after a battle with cystic fibrosis.
Remember him taking me fishing, going out camping.
But something that will never die are Kyle's memories of his father's activism. Raymond spent 3 decades speaking out about the abuse he and many other children suffered in residential schools.
Basically, take advantage of you, you know?
He experienced abuse at the institutions, which he shared as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. and he started whacking me with a long webbed strap.
He did more than speak out. The elder from Peguis First Nation was one of the first people to campaign for compensating survivors in the 80s. Kyle says his father took that trauma and transformed it into determination to seek justice for all Indigenous people who were taken away from home and forced to assimilate.
He saw a deep injustice and that Canada needed to make amends and still need to make amends for their past wrongs and current wrongs. But it was the thing that motivated him every day. Every single day, he helped advocate and fight for survivors.
Raymond was there in the House of Commons in 2008 when then Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to residential school survivors.
The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
But Kyle says his father wasn't content with that victory.
I don't think he even took a day to kind of rest and take some pride in the part that he played. He started automatically thinking about all the people that were left out of that agreement and that apology.
In the final year of his life, Raymond wrote a book about his experiences, which will be on display at the Manitoba Museum. He also received an honorary doctorate from Queen's University, small acknowledgements of a lifetime of work. Rachel Bergen, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So after being really successful there and winning the 2006 Indian Residential School Agreement, in 2009 he decided to launch the Indian Day School class action and was a major part of that before he passed away. So he launched it with his friend Gary McLean, and it was ultimately successful in December 2018, where they were awarded $1.47 billion for 200,000 Indian Day School survivors who had suffered the same types of abuse. And I remember him calling me actually from Parliament that day when it was going to be announced and told me to turn on C-SPAN because there's going to be a big announcement. And you could see him right there behind Carolyn Bennett when it was announced and some other photographs when he got there. And that story and more of that work was detailed in his book that we wrote called Spirit of the Grassroots People. But I would say, especially since it's passed, it's been difficult to see how the Indian Day School class action has actually been enacted in this country. There's been so many complaints and criticisms of it. And in some ways, I'm very glad that Ray's still not with us anymore to see how it's kind of fallen apart in many ways. And if you kind of just look through some of the stories, you'll see some of these issues that have been appearing. So this was from the lawsuit just last week. They had announced that 158,000 day school survivors had been paid out on their claims. And you can see the huge discrepancy in the levels of payment that was paid. So the lowest level was level 1, the highest being level 5, and 120,000 Indian Day Schools, almost students, got level 1. And that clearly shows there's a discrepancy here about where the payments are going and how much. And a lot of day school survivors didn't want to go through this process as there's a lot of reasons. It was COVID, for instance. They had to write what happened to them and also provide historical evidence to get the highest levels of compensation. So a lot just got the base pay, which was only $10,000. And there's been a lot of people kind of raising concerns, I would say, about the class action, including the late Murray Sinclair, who was really upset that day school survivors had to work for themselves to get the compensation, and that they felt that he personally felt that it was a complete opposite direction of what should have actually happened, as well as basically nations across the country raised concerns about how survivors are actually getting access to this form of justice, I would say. Again, there's a few other stories. These are all just headlines. I encourage you to maybe go back and check out after this talk. But Mark Hill, who was chief at the time of Six Nations, actually took the government to court again to try to extend the deadline for claims because it was going to end during kind of the middle of the COVID pandemic. And the federal court denied that plea, as well as NDP MP from the Inuit territories also came forward to try to bring it open through Parliament, and that was ultimately shut down as well at the Supreme Court. So again, showing how day school survivors in many ways haven't got the same form of justice, I would say, as residential school survivors, and really, I think, hurting the history as well, because through the lawsuit that happened with the residential school settlement agreement, there was the Truth and Reconciliation process, and that hasn't happened, unfortunately, for day school survivors. But This takes us to some of the stories I want to tell you today about the Curve Lake or the Mud Lake Indian Day School. And again, I could tell you so much about this. I'll try to give you just a little snippet into what one school was like. And this one was very close to us here where I live. And in many ways, I tried to employ this two-eyed seeing kind of philosophy, which was popularized by the Mi'kmaq. It's been taken up by a lot of Indigenous nations. And I think this photograph really encapsulates my life and my upbringing. So on the right-hand side here, you can see where I spent almost my entire childhood from about the age of about 12 all the way up until just a few years ago when my parents sold their trailer at this trailer park. But you can see it was called Pioneer Point, which is ironically named, I know, right beside Curve Lake First Nation. And the line basically, they basically are right beside each other. You can see how close they are just between these two signs. And on one side was kind of my settler identity, and then on the other was my Indigenous Anishinaabe identity. And I always had questions growing up about why this imaginary line had massive differences in the wealth and the education backgrounds and really the histories of how they understood each other. So on one side, you can see it was a really fancy, and when I say trailer park, you kind of think of Trailer Park Boys, but it was a fancier trailer park. I would say it was kind of vacation type homes. They had some pools you can see, as well as a little golf course and a beach, whereas on the other side, friends that I had in the reserve grew up without clean drinking water. And that was something that was just recently rectified a few years ago. And it was something that really shows how different Canada is just between two small communities here. And I wanted to do more research because I knew the community of Curve Lake had an Indian Day School, and I had friends and family that were from these communities. And I wanted to look more into that history and see why these differences actually had emerged. And that's what I started to do with permission of the chief and council from Curve Lake. So yeah, I can show you a lot of different historical evidence. I looked through 10,000 different documents from Libraries and Archives Canada, as well as did a bunch of oral history interviews that were just completed last summer. But I think showing this one in particular is really powerful, and I'll show you a few other ones this afternoon. But this one I think is the most telling out of all the letters I looked at. And this is a letter from the Department of Indian Affairs. They're talking about kind of the progress of students in the Curve Lake Indian Day School. And I'll translate some of that handwriting for you, but it said this, quote, "One of the chief holdbacks of the Shamong School, the Curve Lake School, is the determination of the parents to stick to their own language, with a few exceptions. They are quite jealous of it and will not favor the use of English by the children when at play." And I think that shows two perspectives here. One, that the government only wanted children to speak English, and they're very concerned about that. There's a bunch of letters kind of worried about what was going on. And number two, that the parents resisted this as much as they could. They allowed their students or their children really to speak their own language, especially out on the playground, but at home as well. And this has protected about 30 Anishinaabe speakers, which is quite high for our area. I know my home community only has 2 speakers left, and Curve Lake has 30. And through these documents, you can see a lot of resistance that comes forward, which was not necessarily people thought was actually in the archive. I think a lot of people just think it's letters between government officials, but there was also letters from the community itself, and tons of resistance comes up time and time again. This was a letter, for instance, in 1910 that talked about saying that they can't find a good teacher in the community, and they're really clear about the racial divide of what was going on too. Even over 115 years ago, it said, "How is it that we cannot get a good teacher like you white people? We pay the teachers as much as you whites pay your teachers." Is the Department of Indian Affairs at Ottawa to be blamed? And again, they wanted education. They wanted education in their own way with an Anishinaabe lens, and they were getting terrible teachers. And that is a story that's happened time and time again across the Indian day school system, unfortunately. The worst of the worst went to these schools. And I'll show you a few examples here of those teachers. One of them here was in 1917, which was actually just yesterday. 108 years ago in February, this letter came from Chief Daniel Weetung to the Department of Indian Affairs, and there's a photo of him on the left-hand side. And I'm going to use some rated R language, but I think it's important just to see how upset the chief was about his treatment of his student and really his daughter in this school, just through this letter here. So he says, quote, "The 30th of November last, she or the teacher wrote on the blackboard a very dirty word, and asked the students to tell her the meaning of that word. They said that they had never heard of such a word and did not know what it meant. Miss Haynes said that Miss Haynes, the teacher, said that there's someone on the reserve, and her name was Daisy Weetung, who is my daughter. Now, you gentlemen at the Department of Indian Affairs, I'll leave that to you to see how you would feel if some lady called your daughter a whore. That is a very dirty piece of business for a school teacher. And again, this was just one of hundreds of complaints they received about Miss Haynes, and she was never actually removed by the government. You can see this was in World War One, and all the able-bodied men in Curve Lake were actually fighting overseas in the World War for Canada at that time. It took until actually after the war, and there's a note in the archive that the men came back and physically removed her from the community. The RCMP investigated and charged some of those men for doing that. But again, it kind of shows you very clearly how the community knew how bad the schools were and were doing everything in their power that they could to try to remove some of these teachers from their communities. And there's some somewhat funny these stories, I think, but also serious as well about just the disaster of how teachers were actually teaching in the Indian Day School. So this letter talks about how this teacher was basically sleeping all day in his classroom, who was not paying attention whatsoever and had a very dirty classroom. But as well, there is this one kind of paragraph that's expanded in a few other letters as well, that the department actually, their own inspector at the time, the chief inspector came and found that he was indifferent and lazy, and that would be in the best interest of the department to allow him to devote all of his time to the education of his trick bear. So basically, he brought a circus bear into the Indian Day School and was training this bear to go on circus tours in the summer. And again, that seems like an outlandish story, that how could that ever actually happen? But I've talked to elders who remember having that bear in the classroom with them, and you can clearly see how bad these teachers were. This kind of circus trainer that should not have been near children at that time, and clearly the government was aware of it. They actually eventually removed this teacher, but instead of actually firing him, they just moved him to Georgina Island, which was kind of in the middle of nowhere in Ontario and hard to get to by anything other than a boat, and really shows how when teachers were causing these issues, they would just move them around the country. Again, more resistance, more things that are happening at the time, and it's kind of important to set this into context as well. This is 1923, and another letter complaining about the lack of progress for their students, saying that no student had actually made it to high school out of the Indian Day School in almost 70 years of the operation of that school. And it said, I understand the government is spending the money to advance Indians. Why not spend it in this section? We are willing to pay more for a qualified teacher, and no other kind will do. And they had about 50 students at that time, and clearly they weren't making progress. And in many ways, the arguments through the book and my dissertation said, but this was on purpose. They did not want educated Indigenous people to be causing problems for them, because in the same year, in 1923, the Williams Treaty was signed. And again, I won't go through all of this stuff, but it's just important to remember that the Williams Treaty was signed in this same year when the government was not allowing education of First Nations to actually go forward in the community. And it was clearly for a reason, which was to steal more land from these Indigenous nations and enter into a treaty agreement, which again was recently just settled in 2019 because of the damages that it caused and because of the lies and the promises that the government actually didn't keep up. And that is important to remember as we talk about these Indian Day Schools, is that one of the big reasons for them was it made kids go to school for most of the year, and by doing that made their families also stay close to those Indian Day Schools, away from their traditional lands, as a way for government to bring in the process of settler colonialism, which is a whole other argument and story, but I think it really underlines all of this progress, or progress if you want to put it in quotes, that the government was trying to do with education then. They eventually had this new school in 1939 that was petitioned for over a decade. Curve Lake tried to bring forward, and you can see some pictures of it there. And there's lots of stories about how that almost didn't happen, but they eventually did get this school. And then sadly, with this school, there's also some hidden experiments that were being done on the community. And this is one from the chief engineer of the Department of Indian Affairs that talks about what was going on in the school. And they talk about this septic tank and this test case, which they did at the Curve Lake School. So they said, quote, the desire to obtain an inexpensive indoor system for use in larger Indian Day schools where a piped water supply is not available, it was decided by the Indian Affair officers to try the system at the Mud Lake or the Curve Lake School as a test case. So they basically put in this septic tank to just see if they could save money at all the other Indian Day schools, as Curve Lake was very close to some of the big city centers, but they could ship it to. And they found that it's failed spectacularly early and actually made a lot of students sick. And they actually had to close the school after being open for only 1 month because the septic system failed in an effort just to close money. And again, this record from the government itself admitting that they're experimenting on a very crucial health function of a school shows you how they cared or did not care about Indigenous children in these institutions at that time. And again, there's a lot of more back and forth letters about the government and how mad the First Nation was about this happening to them and basically being guinea pigs for the government to save money. And again, a very horrific story that came from Curve Lake here. And if we just look briefly at the funding of these schools, you can see that basically Curve Lake was ripped off through the entire time it actually operated. And that was really frustrating. Obviously, some of those letters already talked about that, but I kind of plotted these out, showing the average salary of basically Ontario's teachers at that time and what was being paid in Curve Lake. So the average salary here of a male teacher was this orange line. This blue line was the average salary of an Indian day school, and then this average salary of a female teacher at that one time. And these years where it actually goes over, the government was doing some manipulation of the numbers. You could say they actually had two teachers and they combined them together to show, like, look, the funding is actually equaling out in the 1930s when that was clearly not the case. And again, if you're paying the teachers the lowest out of any other role at the time, you're going to get the worst teachers. And that clearly is what happened in Curve Lake First Nation. So again, that pattern, I think, is very common across Indian day schools in Canada here. And then unfortunately, a lot of the research stops in 1951 because the government has restricted access to the files, which has been very difficult as a historian to go through. So we switched to a lot of oral history, and there's so much oral history from people that are still surviving in the community that we can kind of listen to and learn from. And that's what we've been doing for the last few years, is trying to record that oral history before some of these individuals pass away. So this one guy who, from the 1960s, there were some tapes at Trent actually. He talked about how difficult it was for children at that time to actually be able to speak their own language. They said he talked about how they always talk English all the time, and that he actually predicted that in 100 years that there wouldn't be any Indians around, he didn't think, and that they might have the name Indian, but that's all. And I think that was really depressing to read some of these older oral histories and see how the elders were feeling at that time. And thankfully, the school would close in just a couple more years. And I wish he was still around today, because the Curve Lake Indian Day School, the same building, is now teaching kindergarten Anishinaabe-Moan language program, which I think is a very beautiful full circle story in many ways. There's also this story of Lorenzo Wheatung, who was an elder we have at Trent University, but also attended the Indian Day School. And he actually brought me out to Kinnawajan or the Peterborough petroglyphs is what they're also called, which is the largest collection of rock art in Canada, actually. And I encourage you, if you're ever in this region, to check it out. But he brought me out there and kind of told me a lot of the stories that he had experienced and a lot of horrific violence he experienced. And he said, if I had this teaching when we were out there, kind of gesturing to the rocks, which we believe are our teaching rocks, instead of getting Dick and Jane, which was kind of the common educational books at the time, I wouldn't be in the mess I'm in today. I said he felt that he didn't know whether I was white or Indian, because he felt like he did pretty well in the ways of the white man, but wasn't able actually to connect to his culture until he was much older. And he remembers as well kind of the very first day, and I won't go too much into that quote, but he basically said, it was a really horrific experience seeing kids being forced to go to this school, and then basically the routine of what would emerge from that school every day, which would be the Lord's Prayer and God Save the Queen every single day. And these things had a really negative impact both on his life and the lives of 8 of his brothers and sisters as well. There are some more positive oral histories, I'd say, as well. Chief Elsie Knott, for instance, who was the first female chief of a First Nation in Canada, actually started a language program for the community in the 1960s after the Indian Day School basically hours were, so it was in the night. And then she started busing the local kids to the nearby high school. She bought a bus. You can see her actually pictured there. But there's also some funny stories of her. Her first bus was actually a funeral hearse, and she had converted that into a bus to take kids away from the day school and into a public school at the time, where many of them were not getting that opportunity. And it has a really fantastic legacy you should look into if you don't know anything about Chief Elsie Knott. And then finally, again, you can see some of the more positive stories I think that came out around that time period because of the work by Elsie Knott. There was an art program, there was a language program, there was these kind of academic tests that were showing that the Curve Lakes kids were doing just as well as non-Indigenous kids, despite the fact of the Indian day school that was operating in their community, and that they should have been encouraged to learn their own culture and language from the very beginning. And again, showing how this process has still unfolded over the last 50 or so years here moving forward. So there has been some major research findings. I'll just kind of briefly go through this, but basically that Curve Lake had been fighting for their education since at least 1916 for their own control of it. That these failures at the school emerged from this complex set of reasons that, again, were like underfunding, jurisdictional tensions, paternalism, and systematic racism. And this forced removal of Indigenous languages and cultures has had a very lasting impact. And unfortunately, we don't know the full story because the government, and I would say the United Church, who operated the school as well, doesn't want everyone to fully know. And I think that is somewhat controversial to say. It's kind of conspiratory in some ways saying that. But the government currently is trying to digitize 6 million archival records, and it's not clear if they're actually going to turn those over to the communities or the public. Right now, there's only about 800,000 records actually publicly available, and they have many more in the Gatineau Preservation Center that they're working on. As well as when I tried to work with the United Church for this project, they sent me this kind of contract that basically said, well, one, that they admitted they had 437 files on the Indian Day schools that operated in the country. But number two is that if I were to take this contract, I wasn't allowed to speak about it publicly. And if I would have signed that agreement, I wasn't able to share any of this information only with the United Church, which I think has been really frustrating. And I know Curve Lake First Nation has been really upset with the way I was treated in many ways because I was representing Curve Lake. And I did write an article about that. If you want to look more into that, you can see actually on the United Church Archives page, they've made a response to my article. But I basically have been asking for a long time for church organizations to step up and give these archives back to communities, kind of following ownership, control, access, and possession, or OCAP principles. And that has not really happened yet to my knowledge. And it's something that needs to be focused on as we kind of go back to this page. You'll see here the APTN did a story that only 200, they looked at only actually 600 files or 600 pages of documents of only 46 Indian day schools, as that's all they were able to get their hands on. And they found that 200 students had died. So if you think about 699 Indian day schools, how many children do we not know about that passed away at these schools? So it's something I think has massive ramifications for Indigenous communities. And again, as we come to near the end of my presentation, I'd just like to stress how these have led to ongoing class action lawsuits right now across Canada. So in Quebec just last year in January, the class action was for Quebec Indian Day schools because some were actually left out of that Canadian agreement, which didn't fully make sense to me, but there's some political reasons about why it wasn't included. And that one just actually finished for $50 million as well. Just last year in January as well, just a week later, the Innu Nation from Newfoundland and Labrador launched their own class action lawsuit because they weren't included as well in the class action because Newfoundland and Labrador didn't join Canada until 1949 and they were left out for that reason. And again, that would extend the day schools to 2009. And that is actually going to be held. The hearings for that are happening in September of 2025, so just in a few months. So I encourage you to follow that news story over the next little bit, as those students had the exact same experience in Catholic Indian day schools that operated in that province as well. As well, if we look at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women in Two-Spirit report, we can see that they identified both residential and day school experiences as being an important catalyst for violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. And I think that's also important to recognize as we bring it back to today, that the ramifications of this violence that Indigenous people have experienced is still going. It just didn't end when the day school ended. And it's something we need to reconcile with as Canadians. And again, I think day schools in particular have kind of fallen under the radar in comparison to some of the other experiences that Indigenous people have gone through. So just as we kind of wrap things up, I would encourage you to look at some other research. That's kind of my research is really built on the backs of a lot of other people who have come before, especially people like Helen Raptis, who's written a whole bunch of different articles and books about day schools in BC. Sean Carlton, who you might have heard a few weeks ago, maybe talked about the day schools, but he has a really important book called Lessons in Legitimacy, as well as some other articles and people that are still around as well and we're doing great historical research, such as Alliston Norman, who has done work with Kanien'kehá:ka people or the Mohawk people in Tyendinaga and the Grand River, as well as Washoni Whitebeam, who is doing work right now in Kanien'kehá:ka, which is just outside of Montreal. And she's just working on a dissertation and almost done. And then my last slide is actually kind of promoting my upcoming book, which will tell way more of these stories in depth about the Curve Lake Indian Day School. It's called Students by Day, Colonialism and Resistance at the Curve Lake Indian Day School. And there's a really good foreword by Drew Hayden Taylor, if you know him. He's a pretty famous Indigenous author, and he actually attended that day school as well. So be on the lookout for that book as we kind of end things this afternoon. But again, Miigwech, thank you for having me. I know I kind of went through that pretty quickly, but hopefully you got a good idea about the Indian day school system. Miigwech.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Pend. That was amazing. We'll say goodbye now to the people who have come on Zoom, and then we'll turn it over to the students in the class if they have questions for you after that amazing talk.
Miigwech.
So